Good morning. Good morning. Am I coming through? Yes, I am. Great. Well, this morning we are going to be continuing our Still series, continuing from where we left off. And this series is all about practices and rhythms of stillness. It's all about recentering ourselves on God at the beginning of this new year. And I wonder what image comes to mind for you when you think of stillness. What image comes to mind? Maybe you picture yourself lying in bed, having that sweet moment just before you fall asleep, this moment of quiet to yourself. Or maybe you picture meditation, or lying on a sun lounger on the beach abroad. Or maybe the idea of stillness feels so foreign to you, so unrealistic that you can't even picture what stillness might look like for you. And I wonder what emotion comes to mind. Maybe the idea of stillness gives you joy. Maybe the idea of stillness gives you peace. Or maybe if you're anything like me, the idea of stillness gives you anxiety. What should I be doing right now? This doesn't feel very productive. Surely I can use my time better than being still. I think the reality is, for many of us, the idea of stillness feels very foreign, unrealistic, maybe even uncomfortable. And that's because we live in this world of rush. We live in a world of rush, a society where the words busy and tired are the most common responses to the question, how are you? We used to say that everyone responds to how are you by saying fine or okay. But now everyone's trying to be slightly more real. And instead we've replaced fine with tired or busy. Where busyness is seen as this badge of honor. Because if I'm busy, then it must mean that I'm needed. And if I'm needed, it must mean that I'm important. And if I'm important, this gives me status. And if I have status, I then have security. Busyness is glorified in our society. And not only is busyness glorified, but our restlessness is monetized. And I'm not saying here about our employers or by doing work. I'm talking more about the society in general. I'm talking about the pressures that we each have on our lives to not be satisfied. The advertising on telly that tells you that next thing that you need. The people that you follow on social media that tell you about that must-have item, or the car, or the phone, or the diet plan, or whatever it is. And we're left with this sense of wanting, this sense of needing more. If only I had this, then I will be satisfied. So there's this tiredness and busyness culture, and we couple that with this wanting and needing culture, and then you add the societal focus on achievement. The idea that our value is found in our accomplishments, in our title, in how much we earn, in the amount of promotions that we've had, in how much we have managed to achieve. And then this obsession with achievement that we can so easily fall into ensures that we continue in this cycle of striving that leads to busyness, that leads to tiredness. This focus on achievement, coupled with the wanting and needing more, and with the busyness culture, we get trapped in this cycle, striving, busyness, tiredness. And the reality is, this constant striving, doing more and more, getting more and more busy and more tired, always striving, always 100 miles an hour. The reality is, this is very unhealthy for us, for our mental well-being, for our physical health, and for our spiritual formation. Because I don't know about you, but when I am super busy and super tired and super stressed, I do not produce super fruit. When I'm super busy, when I'm tired, when I'm stressed, the fruit that I produce is not great. I'm not full of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. I'm not full of gentleness or self-control. These things do not come out of me when I am super tired, super stressed. And if I'm honest about it, I can fake it pretty well. I don't know if you can relate to this. Being super tired, super stressed, and being able to fake it for a while, put on an act of being all okay. But then behind closed doors, it's where this bad fruit comes out, where the lack of good fruit is shown. And I've realised so much since having Ottilie and Hudson that when you're tired, when it's 3 a.m. and you've slept so far for 15 minutes, and you're getting frustrated and you're thinking, can you just sleep? That's when you see some of this bad fruit come out, in the tiredness, in the frustration. Emma and I are not really a couple who argue much, but it's in those moments that you see the worst of us and of our relationship. We start debating who's the more tired person right now. Well, earlier I was awake with the baby for half an hour, and when I was awake with the baby, I saw you sleeping, so I know you've had half an hour's sleep, so it must be your turn now. Because obviously, if you manage to convince the other person that you're the more tired of the two of you, then you are the one who wins and gets that moment of sleep. The reality is, it's in those moments of being tired, stressed, and busy that it's so easy to become self-centered and selfish, to become cranky, to become not very patient and kind. I don't know about you, but when I see someone who is clearly really tired, really busy, really stressed, I'm rarely thinking, I wish I was in their position right now. I wish I could be that tired, that busy, that stressed. For those of you who don't know, I have a dog called Alfie. And Alfie is absolutely obsessed with his ball. It's the love of his life, his ball. And we realised quite early on to having Alfie that his obsession with the ball was actually a little bit dangerous. Because when I take Alfie out and take him to the park and let him off the lead, he is very single-minded. All he wants to do is chase that ball over and over and over again. Whatever the weather, he wants to chase that ball every minute. And the problem is he's so focused on chasing that ball and bringing it back to you, for you to throw it and him to chase it again, that he's totally unaware of his body. And we realize this very early on in his life, that he really will chase the ball until he collapses. And only if he collapses and throws up and overheats will he stop chasing that ball. And often we can be a little bit like that. We can be so obsessed with striving and wanting, filling our time, being more and more busy and getting more and more tired, but just pushing through continuously, day after day after day. And maybe we give ourselves a distraction from our busyness and our tiredness. We put on the telly for an hour in the evening. But it becomes a bit like having an electric car that we charge every evening just enough to get us to the destination for the next place. We charge the car just enough to get us through the next day. So we begin each day with 20% battery because that's all we need to get through, and we end each day with 2%. And then we charge up, we distract ourselves, we get back up to that 20%, just enough to get us through the day, just enough to go again, just enough to be able to continue to strive, just enough to be able to work the next day, just enough to be able to want the next day, just enough to be able to do what we need to do the next day. But the reality is, living with this maximum of 20% is not what God intended for any of us. He intended for us to live life to the full. He intended for us to enjoy life. Yet just like Alfie, so often we continue to chase. We keep this cycle, this routine, day after day, week after week, year after year, never peaking above that 20%. And eventually, it leads us to exhaustion. It leads us to bad fruit. It leads us to even burnout, ill health, anxiety, and worse. So the question this morning, as we look at these rhythms and these patterns of stillness, the question is there a practice of Jesus, another way of doing life, another rhythm that we can get hold of to counteract this cycle, to stop this continuous chasing, to step off the treadmill of constant wanting, working, and worrying? And the answer is yes, there is. And it's called Sabbath. The Hebrew word for Sabbath in the Bible is Shabbat. And it's a word that's used to describe a day each week set aside for stopping, resting, delighting, and worshipping. A day of intentionally stepping off the treadmill. A day of intentionally breaking this cycle of striving and instead enjoying rest and enjoying God and enjoying his creation. And what I'd love to do this morning is just to spend a little bit of time exploring the practice of the Sabbath. What is it? How did it come about? And how was it practiced in the Old Testament and the New Testament? And then look at the question, is Sabbath relevant for us here today? And if it is relevant for us, what should and could the practice of Sabbath look like in our lives? So as Mary Poppins says, let's start at the very beginning. The first use of the word Shabbat comes in the Bible in the creation story. In Genesis 1, we read of the creation of the world. And within the creation story itself, we see a rhythm of work and of rest. The creation story talks of 6 days of work, of creation, followed by a 7th day of Shabbat, of rest or Sabbath. And now don't get too bogged down right now by the day part. Whether you believe creation to be literal 7 days is irrelevant. What is relevant is that the writers are clearly introducing this pattern. The writers are clearly introducing a pattern of Shabbat. How even God himself took a day to rest and to enjoy what he had created. It says this is Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 to 3. By the 7th day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the 7th day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it he rested, Shabbat is the word used, from all the work of creating that he had done. And I wanted to mention this first use of the word Shabbat, the first use of Sabbath, because it's really helpful for us to understand the history of Sabbath. Because later on in Exodus, we're going to be looking at a few different passages over this morning where Shabbat is used. And later on in the book of Exodus, when Moses receives the 10 commandments, the fourth commandment says this. This is Exodus 20, 8 to 11. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So the fourth commandment given to Moses and to the Israelites talks of remembering the Sabbath by keeping it holy, by having it set apart. Set apart the Sabbath. And it cites the reasoning, if you notice, as to reflect the rhythm set by God in creation. So he says, keep the Sabbath holy, keep it set apart to reflect what the rhythm that God created. And what followed this is they were given a load of laws and told this might help you as you try to keep the Sabbath. Now, a little bit of Old Testament background for those who don't know. In the book of Exodus, we read of the 10 Commandments being given to Moses and then to the Israelites at Mount Sinai after their escape from Egypt. And this took place about 3 months after they escaped slavery in Egypt. But if you go a bit forward in your Bible, if you go forward to Deuteronomy, we read of Moses gathering the Israelites 40 years later. So 40 years after Moses had these 10 commandments, he gathers the Israelites together, and this is now the next generation. So this is now the children of those that were in slavery 40 years later, with the next generation on the edge of Canaan, which was the promised land. Moses gets all of the Israelites together, this next generation, and retells some of the key parts of the Torah. And in chapter 5, he retells the 10 Commandments. And you'll notice as you read the 10 Commandments in Deuteronomy, they are the same commandments, but they are told differently. They were told in a different way and have slightly different emphasis or reasoning behind it. And one of the clearest change in emphasis comes with this commandment about the Sabbath. It says this: observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy, as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your ox, your donkey, or any of your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns, so that your male and female servants may rest as you do. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath. So there are two key changes here. In Exodus, we read that it starts saying, remember the Sabbath by keeping it holy. And now in Deuteronomy, we read, observe the Sabbath. But what's particularly interesting about this is the reasoning behind this, the reasoning given as to why they should observe the Sabbath. Remember, in the commandment in Exodus, it was about remembering the Sabbath as a reminder to the rhythm of creation set by God. But now the commandment is to observe the Sabbath 40 years later. And why is it that they are told to observe the Sabbath? The reason is to commemorate the deliverance from Egypt, from oppression, from slavery. The new reasoning given for keeping the Sabbath is to commemorate that God has taken them out of slavery in Egypt. And why would practicing and observing the Sabbath remind them of this? Well, because the whole theme of their slavery in Egypt was overwork. Pharaoh treated them like assets and was sweating the asset for all that it had. He had them making bricks, building supply cities. 7 days a week, all day long, these slaves, the Israelites, were building bricks to create this city. And still he was calling them lazy. If they ever wanted to have a moment to sacrifice to God, Pharaoh would call them lazy. He forced them to work harder. The theme of the Israelites in Egypt was constant work with no rest. They were in this brutal, oppressive regime, and they were being forced to continuously work harder and harder and harder. So whilst the commandment in Exodus about the Sabbath was about enjoying the creation and resting in it, the commandment of the Sabbath in Deuteronomy was all about resistance. It was a warning to them. Do not let the regime of Egypt become your regime. It was a warning against the oppressed becoming oppressors, as so often happens, as we know from the history of the earth. Hence the conversation around ensuring that slaves, workers, and even animals had their Sabbath. But more than that, it was a reminder by God to the Israelites of the basic human need for rest, the importance of stopping. And Moses used their history when they were forced into never getting off the treadmill, forced into this continual cycle, to say, you are free from the cycle, never become slaves to it again, and never force others to become slaves to it either. God is saying, look guys, you are free. Don't act as if you are not. Do not become slaves to anything. Do not return to becoming slaves to activity, slaves to doing, slaves to working. Live out as the free person that you are. And Sabbath is a practice that ensures this, that they do not become slaves to anything, that they do not become slaves to work, that they do not become slaves to activity, that they do not become slaves to striving and wanting. And now here's the thing. What I don't want to do this morning is be dramatic and say that we are just like slaves. But I do believe that this is a warning that is as relevant for us today as it has ever been. Because whilst we are not forced into slavery, into working, although let's not forget that there are many around the world today that are, we in this room have been shaped by a society of working, of wanting, of striving, of worrying. A society that needs more, that works harder, that is never satisfied. And it is so easy for us to become addicted to this routine, to this rhythm, without even recognizing. To this rhythm of not stopping, this rhythm of not living, to a rhythm of only ever getting our charge up to 20%. And Sabbath is a routine created to break the addiction of accomplishment and accumulation. So what might Sabbath look like for us? Well, let me start by saying that Sabbath is a God-given gift. It's a gift of rest, an invitation, if you like, into restorative rest in the presence of God. Most scholars would argue that in the post-Jesus covenant, we are not bound by law to the Sabbath or to any of the laws regarding it. And I don't really want to get too sidetracked just because we don't have time this morning into that debate and why most scholars would say we are not bound by it. But to be honest, regardless of whether we are commanded to Sabbath or invited into Sabbath, the practice of it is a very healthy one, and that is why God created it. The practice of Sabbath is created to help us to live life and to live life to the full. In Mark chapter 2, Jesus is confronted by the Pharisees about Sabbath laws. It says this, Mark chapter 2, verses 23 to 28. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick up heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for the priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.'" Jesus describes the Sabbath as made for man, or better translation, mankind, rather than mankind made for the Sabbath. And what he's basically saying here is, remember why Sabbath was created. It was created to help you to remember that you are free, not to make you bound. It was created to help you rest, not make you more tired. It was created to help you live life to the full, not struggle. So as we look at what Sabbath might look like for us, it's worth each of us reflecting on ourselves, asking the question, what brings me rest? What fills me up? A question that I'd love us to think about over the rest of the day and maybe the coming days is, what can you commit to doing for 24 hours every week that will bring you deep joy and deep rest? Because Sabbath is all about setting aside a day every week to experience the fullness of God and the fullness of life, and therefore setting us up to flourish. It's a day of resting in the presence of God. John Mark Comer, who writes brilliantly on issues around rest and Sabbath, talks about 4 verbs that the Hebrew word Shabbat is associated with. And these 4 verbs give us a great framework to shape what maybe our Sabbath could look like. And then here are the verbs. The first verb is to stop. Stepping off the treadmill. Taking a break from work. And reflecting, as said in Exodus, this rhythm set by God in creation. And this is probably the hardest of the 4 verbs, because we aren't used to doing this. We aren't used to taking a day to completely stop and get off that treadmill, the treadmill of work, of wanting, of worrying. The next verb is rest, a time to recharge, to break the addiction of activity, to resist the temptation to achieve, and instead to just simply be. And this rest is physical, it's mental, and it's emotional. A day set aside to rest. The third verb is delight. Sabbath isn't a day of religious duty. It's designed as a day that is life-giving for all of us. A full day set aside to do the things that bring us life. And to switch off from everything other than this. Enjoying life and enjoying creation. The actual word used to talk about delight talks about partying. It talks about gathering people and partying together. Sabbath, although it's so often made to feel like a religious duty, it was created to have so much freedom and enjoyment within it. To delight, to party, to enjoy life, to enjoy creation. And the final verb is worship. To give God praise, to spend time in his presence. Because Sabbath is a day set apart, holy, set apart for God. And remember that worship isn't just about singing songs to God, it's also about enjoying what he has created. Living life to the full. In giving thanks to God. In giving glory to God. I think there's so much relevance, maybe even need today for us to practice the Sabbath. Yet the reality is most of us, most Christians in the West, don't practice Sabbath at all. Other than going to church on a Sunday and calling it Sabbath, the reality is most of us don't practice Sabbath. For me and Emma, our Sabbath is a Friday. Because obviously, Sunday is a work day for me. So Friday, we decided together, would be our Sabbath. And it isn't a day of heavy rules, but it is an intentional day that we block out together to spend the time with each other, to go on a walk every Sabbath, to eat round a table rather than in front of the TV, to try to rest. And on my Sabbath, when it is a Friday, sometimes I work Friday and it becomes a Thursday, but for me, I commit then not to respond to any emails, and I try not to think about anything that I might need to prepare for a Sunday. And now, don't get me wrong, Em and I could be so much more intentional about our Sabbath, and actually, we've talked about wanting to be. And Sabbath has become a lot more difficult since having a 5-month-old and a 21-month-old, because switching off is so much more difficult. But we try not to be overly legalistic about it. But a great question to ask yourself if you're wanting to practice the Sabbath is, how can I be intentional about ensuring that one day a week I will stop, I will rest, I will delight, and I will worship? A day without striving, without working, without wanting, even, if possible, without worrying. Often our days off work become days to catch up with the unpaid work. On the housework, on sorting out the bills, on buying the clothes that we need, on doing the weekly shop. These days are work, just they're not paid, and they have a different focus. The practice of Sabbath says, for one day a week, I commit to just living and being. To enjoy life, to enjoy God, to enjoy his creation, to enjoy rest, and to enjoy the company of others. Like I said, for me, this is a Friday, but for you, it might be a Sunday. And coming to church to worship with your community could be a part of that. But Sabbath is so much more than just that. What I'd love you to do is over lunch to think about, or if you're with other people, talk about what Sabbath might look like for your household. What practices would ensure that you would have a full day of stopping, of resting, of delighting, and of worshipping? And I'd encourage you to be intentional about it, because if you're not intentional, it doesn't happen. If you're not intentional about Sabbath, it won't happen. And maybe even be bold. Maybe for you, to put your phone away for a big chunk of the day would help you to switch off from the striving, the working, the wanting, the worrying. Or maybe it's about ensuring that there's enough preparations done beforehand to allow your day of Sabbath to be a day without any housework. Whatever it looks like, I'd encourage you to give it a go. God invites us into a rhythm of Sabbath, of rest, not because he wants to be controlling, but because he wants us to have life to the full, to experience the fullness of life. And I don't know about you, but for me, if God created it so that we would have life to the full, then it's something that I want to step into. We're going to have a time of communion now. If the servers can prepare the tables and the worship band come up, that would be great. Jesus said, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Jesus promises rest in him. In his presence, we find rest. And maybe this morning, you're feeling tired. Maybe this morning, you're feeling exhausted. You're feeling burnt out. Trapped in this cycle of busyness, of striving, of wanting, of seeking approval. And Jesus says, "Come to me, come with all your burdens, with all your tiredness. Come to me and you will find rest." So as we come forward in a moment to take the bread and take the juice, I want to encourage you to take it back to your seats and have a moment with God where you say, "Lord, give me rest." Because of Jesus' broken body and the blood poured out for us, we will one day have everlasting rest. But today he offers us this exchange. He says, "Come to me with your burdens, your tiredness, and I will give you rest." So the worship band are going to quietly play as we take communion. But in your own time, why don't you go over to one of the 4 stations in the corners of this room, take your bread and your juice and take it back to your seats and say, "God, will you give me rest?" There's gluten-free on all stations. So in your own time, why don't we go forward and take the bread and the juice.